5 years ago, her first love vanished without a trace. Today, she's about to be hanged for murdering the husband she never truly loved. In her most desperate moment, just as Elizabeth Hart has accepted her fate, the familiar sound of hoofbeats echoes from the past. Does destiny truly exist to bring him back at the perfect time? Or has he returned too late, only to watch the love of his life be murdered by blind justice? The coarse, abrasive rope pressed against Elizabeth Hart's neck, a ghastly sensation under the morning sun that cast long, phantom-like shadows across the dusty town square of Willow Creek. Below, a crowd had gathered, their faces a chaotic mix of curiosity and bloodlust. Some came for justice, others for the spectacle, but all had come to watch a widow hang. Liza's hands were bound tightly behind her back, but her spine remained ramrod straight. Her defiant green eyes swept over the sea of people below without a trace of fear. Just 6 months ago, she had been a respected member of this community, a rancher's wife with land status and a wide-open future. Now she stood here, accused of murdering her own husband, branded a killer by the very people who once called her neighbor. Elizabeth Hart. Sheriff Coleman's voice boomed across the square as he read from a crumpled piece of paper. You have been found guilty of the willful murder of your husband, Thomas Hart, by poison. Do you have any last words? Liza lifted her chin higher, her voice carrying clear and strong over the crowd's murmurs. I am innocent of this crime. And one day, the truth will be brought to light. And then, in the distance, atop the hill overlooking Willow Creek, the silhouette of a lone rider appeared. His horse kicked up a cloud of dust, galloping hard toward the town. 6 months earlier, the tragedy had begun. 6 months earlier, the tragedy had begun in a land that was once a paradise. The Hart Ranch was then a picture of prosperity. Lush green pastures stretched as far as the eye could see, nurtured by the crystal-clear waters of Willow Creek, which wound through the land like a silver ribbon. The soil was fertile, the cattle were fat, and the future seemed endlessly bright for Thomas and Elizabeth Hart. Thomas Hart was a good man, steady and hardworking, devoted to the ranch his father had carved out of the Colorado wilderness. At 42, he was 14 years older than Liza, but their marriage was built on mutual respect and shared dreams. He had courted her properly, married her in the little church on Main Street, and given her a life that an orphan girl from the East had never dared to dream of. That fateful October morning began like any other. Liza was in the kitchen preparing breakfast while Thomas mounted his horse to check on the north pasture. The creek was running higher than usual due to the early autumn rains, and he wanted to make sure the herd wasn't getting too close to the swollen, churning banks. Be careful out there, Liza had called after him, her silhouette in the doorway, her apron still dusted with flour and her eyes showing a hint of worry. The creek is running fast today. Thomas had turned back to smile at her, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes deepening in his sun-weathered face. Don't you worry about me, darling. I've been riding these lands since before you were born. A little water never hurt anybody. Those were the last words her husband ever spoke. When Thomas's horse returned alone 2 hours later, Liza knew something terrible had happened. She saddled her own mare and rode out to find him, her heart pounding in her chest with dread. She found Thomas face down in the creek, his body caught against a fallen log, the hoofprints telling a story of a spooked animal in a tragic fall. Dr. Williams had examined the body and declared it an accidental death. Thomas had likely been thrown from his horse when it startled, then hit his head on the rocks as he fell. Such accidents were common in ranch country, and no one questioned the doctor's findings. No one, except for Colonel James Morgan. Morgan owned an empire of cattle and influence that spanned 3 counties. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. And what he wanted was the Hart Ranch, or more specifically, the water rights that came with it. The first visit came a week after the funeral. Lisa was still in black when Morgan's carriage rolled up to her door. The colonel was a distinguished man in his 50s, with silver hair and calculating blue eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Hart," he said, tipping his hat as he stepped onto her porch, "please accept my condolences for your tragic loss. Thomas was a good man." "Thank you, Colonel," Lisa replied, though something in his manner set her on edge. "I will get straight to the point," Morgan continued, his voice shifting to a businesslike tone. "A woman alone on a ranch this size. It's not safe, nor is it practical. I would like to make you an offer for the property." "A generous offer." Liza's back stiffened. "This ranch is not for sale, Colonel. Everything is for sale at the right price, my dear. I am prepared to offer $50,000 in cash." It was a substantial sum, but Liza knew why Morgan craved it so badly. Whoever controlled Willow Creek controlled the entire valley. "I appreciate the offer," Lisa said firmly, "but this is my home. I am not leaving." Morgan's smile turned to ice. "I hope you'll reconsider, Mrs. Hart. A woman in your position, well, you might find life rather difficult without a man's protection." It was the first threat, though it was veiled in polite words, and it was only the beginning of her nightmare. That threat was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the pressure tightened around Elizabeth. Morgan's men began brazenly cutting across her land, claiming rights that didn't exist. Her cattle started disappearing, just a few at first, then larger numbers. Fences were cut, water troughs mysteriously contaminated, and her ranch hands began receiving better job offers from elsewhere. One by one, Lisa watched her hired men ride away, leaving her alone on a ranch too large to manage. When she tried to hire replacements, she discovered that a rumor had been spread. The Hart Ranch was unlucky, dangerous, no place for honest men. Still, Lisa refused to sell. She learned to do the work herself, rising before dawn to tend the cattle, mend fences, and keep the ranch running. Her hands grew calloused, her back ached, and her savings dwindled, but her resolve never wavered. This was her land, her home, and she would be damned if she let James Morgan scare her away. The accusations began in late winter. First came the subtle whispers, the conversations that fell silent when she entered the general store, then the meaningful glances exchanged when she passed on the street. Dr. Williams, who had declared Thomas's death an accident, suddenly began to express doubts about his initial findings. "I've been thinking about your husband's death," he told her one February afternoon when she came to town for supplies. "Some of the symptoms I observed, they are consistent with certain types of poisoning." Lisa stared at him in shock. "Poisoning?" "Dr. Williams, you examined him yourself. You said it was an accident." "I said it appeared to be an accident," the doctor corrected, his eyes avoiding hers. "But I have been consulting with colleagues in Denver, and they have raised some troubling questions. Perhaps we should exhume the body to conduct a more thorough examination." The suggestion hit Lisa like a physical blow. "You want to dig up my husband's grave? For the sake of justice, Mrs. Hart, surely you want to know the truth." But Liza was beginning to suspect that the truth had very little to do with what was happening in Willow Creek. When she looked into Dr. Williams's eyes, she saw the same calculation she had seen in Morgan's. The look of a man who had been bought and paid for. The exhumation took place on a cold March morning. Lisa stood by her husband's grave, watching strangers violate the peace she had tried to build around his memory. Dr. Williams emerged from his examination with a grimly triumphant look, announcing that he had found traces of arsenic in Thomas's system. "Enough to kill a man," he declared to the assembled crowd. "This was no accident. This was murder." All eyes turned to Liza, the grieving widow who stood to inherit everything. Her refusal to sell the ranch suddenly seemed suspicious. Her competence became evidence of premeditation. Her strength became proof of guilt. Within a week, Sheriff Coleman had issued a warrant for her arrest. The trial was a mockery, its verdict predetermined by men who had already decided her fate. And now, as the noose settled around her neck, Lisa understood exactly how far James Morgan was willing to go to get what he wanted. As she lay on the narrow cot, listening to the sounds of hammers and saws erecting the gallows outside, Lisa found herself thinking of Nathan Cross. It had been 5 years since he had left Willow Creek without a word of explanation. She had loved him so much. Even now, facing death, she could still remember. As dawn approached, Liza pushed thoughts of Nathan aside. He was a part of her past, and she was about to have no future. The guards came as the first rays of sun painted the eastern sky. They bound her hands, placed the hemp rope around her neck, and led her out to face the justice Colonel Morgan had purchased. Nathan Cross had been riding without rest for 3 days, pushing his horses to their limits, switching mounts at every way station between Denver and Willow Creek. The telegram had reached him at his hotel in the capital, where he had been tracking a particularly elusive bounty. The message was brief but devastating. Elizabeth Hart condemned to hang for husband's murder. Execution at dawn April 15th. Come quickly if you can. Dr. Williams. A bitter irony that the same man who helped frame Liza was the one warning him of her fate. Williams was a weak man, easily bought, but his conscience was not entirely dead. It seemed even he had a limit to what he would do for Colonel Morgan's gold. Nathan had abandoned his bounty without a second thought. 5 years of trying to forget Elizabeth Hart. 5 years of telling himself he'd made the right choice in leaving. And now he was racing back to save the woman he had never stopped loving. As his horse thundered down the main street of Willow Creek, Nathan could see the crowd gathered in the square, could make out the wooden platform and the figure in the faded blue dress standing beneath the hangman's noose. His heart clenched at the sight of Lisa, older, thinner, but still beautiful. Still defiant even in the face of death. "Stop!" Nathan's voice boomed across the square as he brought his horse to a sliding halt near the platform. "Stop this execution!" Sheriff Coleman looked up in surprise, his hand frozen on the lever that would drop the trapdoor. "Nathan Cross? What in the hell are you doing here?" Nathan swung down from his horse, his hand instinctively checking the colt at his hip. He was dressed in black leather and worn denim, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Every inch of him screamed of the dangerous bounty hunter he had become. The crowd parted before him like water. "I'm here to stop a miscarriage of justice," Nathan announced, his gray eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. "This woman is innocent." Colonel Morgan stepped forward from the crowd, his face a mask of polite confusion. "Mr. Cross, I'm afraid you are mistaken. Mrs. Hart has been tried and convicted by a jury of her peers. The law must take its course." Nathan's smile was as cold as winter steel. "The law, Colonel? Is that what you call this circus?" His gaze swept over the townspeople, many of whom looked away when he stared at them. "I know what this is really about. I know about the railroad deal, about the water rights, about the fortune you stand to make from this woman's death." A murmur ran through the crowd. "That is a serious allegation," Morgan replied smoothly. "Do you have any proof of these wild claims?" Nathan reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "As a matter of fact, I do. This is a copy of the contract between you and the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, signed 3 months before Thomas Hart's death. Funny how you were so certain you'd be able to deliver the Hart Ranch water rights, considering the property wasn't for sale. And I have evidence that Thomas Hart was murdered, not by his wife, but by your men." Nathan turned to the crowd. 3 weeks ago, a dying man named Jake Sullivan confessed to the murder of Thomas Hart. Sullivan was one of Morgan's hired guns, brought in specifically to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of the railroad deal. The crowd erupted in angry voices. Nathan held up a hand for silence and continued. "According to Sullivan's confession, He and another man ambushed Thomas Hart near the creek. They knocked him unconscious, then held his head under water until he drowned. The arsenic was injected into the body afterward to cast suspicion upon Mrs. Hart. Dr. Williams stepped forward, his face ashen with guilt. "It's true," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Colonel Morgan paid me to alter my findings to claim I'd found arsenic when I hadn't. I was desperate." That confession opened the floodgates. Mrs. Henderson admitted she was paid to lie about selling rat poison. Billy Patterson confessed he was coached to invent a story about an argument. One by one, the web of lies Morgan had so carefully woven began to unravel. Preposterous! Morgan sputtered, but his protests were drowned out by the angry voices of the crowd. People who had been too afraid to speak up now shouting accusations. Seeing which way the wind was blowing, Sheriff Coleman quickly moved to untie Liza's bonds and remove the noose from her neck. She collapsed to her knees on the platform, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of her fate. Nathan was by her side in an instant, his strong arms helping her to her feet. For a moment, they just looked at each other. 5 years of separation, hurt, and longing passing between them in a single glance. "You came back," Liza whispered, her voice hoarse from the pressure of the rope. "I never really left," Nathan replied, his thumb gently wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Not in any way that mattered." The crowd was calling for Colonel Morgan's arrest, but when they turned to look for him, he had vanished in the chaos. "Let him run," Nathan said, his voice grim. "A man like Morgan leaves a trail. I'll find him." But for now, all that mattered was that Liza was safe, that justice had prevailed, and that the woman he'd never stopped loving was back in his arms. The nightmare was over, but the real story was just beginning. The aftermath of the failed execution was chaos. Angry townspeople demanded answers, Sheriff Coleman tried to maintain order, and Colonel Morgan's remaining supporters melted away like snow in spring. But Nathan Cross had work to do. While Liza was taken to Dr. Williams's office to recover from her ordeal, Nathan commandeered the sheriff's office to conduct his own investigation. He spread documents across Coleman's desk like a general planning a campaign. "How long did you suspect?" Liza asked from the doorway. She had been cleaned up and changed into a simple green dress, but she still looked fragile, like a woman who had stared death in the face and lived. Nathan looked up, once again struck by her beauty. 5 years had changed her, but she was still the woman who had stolen his heart. "I suspected something was wrong when I heard about Thomas's death," Nathan admitted. "Until Dr. Williams sent me that telegram." "Why did he warn you?" "He was part of Morgan's scheme." Nathan's expression darkened. "Williams is weak, not evil. When he realized Morgan actually intended to let you hang, it was too much for his conscience. He reached out to me because he knew I would." He paused, searching for the right words. Double quotes. "Because he knew what you would do?" Liza prompted. "Because he knew I would never let anything happen to you," Nathan finished quietly. "No matter what passed between us before." The air between them grew thick with unspoken history. Liza stepped into the office, closing the door behind her. "Nathan. About why you left. "We don't need to talk about that now," Nathan interrupted, though his eyes never left her face. "Right now we need to focus on finishing what Morgan started." But Liza wouldn't let it go. "Yes, we do need to talk about it. You disappeared without a word, Nathan. One day you were talking about marriage, about building a life together, and the next you were gone. I mourned you as if you were dead." Nathan's jaw clenched. "You married Thomas Hart 6 months later. Because I thought you were never coming back." Liza's voice rose, years of hurt and confusion pouring out. "Because you left me with nothing but questions and a broken heart. I left because I had to," Nathan said harshly. "Because staying would have destroyed us both." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, His voice was heavy with old pain. "I left because Colonel Morgan threatened to kill you if I didn't." The words hit Lisa like a physical blow. She sank into a chair, staring at Nathan in shock. "Morgan wanted your water rights even back then," Nathan explained. "He said if I married you, you'd have an unfortunate accident within the month. If I stayed in town, the same thing would happen. The only way to keep you safe was to leave and never come back. Why didn't you tell me?" Nathan's laugh was bitter. "Tell you what? That the most powerful man in the territory wanted you dead, and the only way to protect you was to break your heart? That I was too much of a coward to stay and fight for you?" "You're not a coward," Lisa said fiercely. "You came back. You saved my life. I came back too late. You married Thomas, built a life, and I became what I needed to become to survive without you." The pain in his voice was almost unbearable. Lisa reached across the desk and took his hand. "Nathan, I need you to understand something. I cared for Thomas, but I never loved him the way I loved you. He was a good man, and he deserved better than a wife who was still in love with someone else." Nathan's fingers tightened around hers. "Liza, I never stopped loving you." "I know," she whispered, "even when I hated you for leaving. You were always there, in the back of my mind." Before Nathan could respond, the office door burst open. Sheriff Coleman stumbled in, his face pale, his shirt torn. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. "Morgan's back," he gasped. "He's got men with him. A lot of men. They've taken over the bank and they're holding hostages." Nathan was on his feet instantly, checking his weapons. "He's making his final play," he said, his voice grim. "He'll burn this whole town down rather than face justice." Lisa stood as well, her face set with determination. "What can I do to help?" "You can stay here where it's safe," Nathan replied automatically. "Like hell," Lisa shot back. "This is my fight too. Morgan tried to kill me, destroyed my life, murdered my husband. I am not hiding while you face him alone." Nathan wanted to argue, but one look at her face told him it was useless. This was the Liza he remembered, fierce, stubborn, and brave. "Can you still shoot?" he asked. Liza's smile was as sharp as a blade. "Thomas made sure I could handle any gun we owned." Nathan nodded, making a quick decision. "One way or another, this ends today." The Willow Creek Bank, a solid brick building, had now become a besieged fortress. Inside, Colonel Morgan and his hired guns were barricaded with hostages. Outside, the townspeople gathered on the street, unsure of what to do. From the cover of the general store across the street, Nathan surveyed the situation. Morgan had chosen his fortress well. The thick walls and small windows would make any assault costly. "We can't just charge in there," Sheriff Coleman said nervously. "He'll kill the hostages." "Morgan isn't going to kill the hostages unnecessarily," Nathan replied, his eyes still fixed on the building. "He needs them alive to guarantee his escape. He's a chess player, always thinking 3 moves ahead. But he's also a coward who lets other people do his dirty work." Nathan's plan was audacious in its simplicity. While the townsmen created a distraction at the front, Nathan and Liza would approach from the rear. But instead of trying to break in, they would wait. "He'll try to escape through the back when he realizes we aren't going to meet his demands," Nathan explained. "Morgan is too proud to surrender, and too smart to think he can hold out indefinitely. When he runs, we'll be there waiting." As the sun reached its zenith, Nathan gave the signal. Sheriff Coleman and a dozen townsmen approached the front of the bank, calling for Morgan to surrender. The response was immediate and predictable. Gunfire from the windows and shouted demands for safe passage. Meanwhile, Nathan and Liza crept into the alley behind the bank. The back door was guarded by 2 of Morgan's men, tough-looking characters with the cold eyes of professional killers. Nathan motioned for Liza to stay back, then moved forward with the fluid grace of a predator. The first guard never knew what Hit him. Nathan's knife found the gap between his ribs with surgical precision. The second guard turned at the sound of his partner's fall, but Nathan was already moving. A swift blow to the throat dropped the second man, gasping. "Remind me never to get on your bad side," Liza whispered as they dragged the unconscious guards into the shadows. "You were on my bad side for 5 years," Nathan replied with a grim smile. "Look how that turned out." They positioned themselves on either side of the back door and waited. The back door opened cautiously, and moments later, Colonel Morgan himself appeared, flanked by 2 more gunmen. He looked disheveled, his usually immaculate appearance gone, his silver hair unkempt. His expensive suit rumpled and stained with sweat. "Where do you think you're going, Colonel?" Nathan stepped out of the shadows, his Colt already drawn and aimed at Morgan's chest. Morgan's face went white, then flushed red with rage. "Nathan Cross, I should have killed you 5 years ago when I had the chance. You should have tried." Nathan replied coolly. Morgan's 2 remaining gunmen reached for their weapons but froze when Liza appeared from the other side of the doorway, her own gun trained on them with a hand as steady as rock. "I wouldn't," she said softly. "I have nothing left to lose, and I'm feeling a mite trigger-happy after spending the morning with a rope around my neck." "Mrs. Hart," Morgan said, attempting to regain his composure. "How lovely to see you alive and well. I do hope there are no hard feelings about this morning's misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Liz's voice was deadly quiet. "You murdered my husband. You tried to steal my land. You nearly had me hanged for a crime I didn't commit. And you call that a misunderstanding?" Morgan's facade finally cracked completely. "Your husband was a fool who stood in the way of progress. That land should have been mine by rights." "Progress built on murder and theft," Nathan said. "That's not civilization, Morgan. That's just greed dressed up in fancy words." Just then, voices came from inside the bank. The sheriff and his men had breached the front entrance. Morgan's eyes darted between Nathan and Liza. "You can't prove anything. Sullivan's confession won't hold up in court." "You're forgetting something, Colonel," Nathan said with a cold smile. "I've been building a case against you for months, Morgan. Every dirty deal, every bribe, every threat. And as for Jake Sullivan, did you really think he just conveniently died of his wounds?" The truth hit Morgan like a physical blow. Sullivan is in protective custody in Denver, ready to tell his story to a federal judge. For the first time since Nathan had known him, Colonel James Morgan looked truly defeated. His shoulders sagged, his aristocratic bearing crumbled. But Nathan knew men like Morgan never go quietly. "Liza, get back!" Nathan shouted as Morgan suddenly lunged forward, a hidden derringer appearing in his hand. The next few seconds passed in a blur of gunfire and chaos. Morgan's shot went wide as Nathan tackled him, the 2 men crashing to the ground. One of Morgan's gunmen tried to draw on Liza, but her husband's training served her well. Her Colt barked once, and the man dropped with a bullet in his shoulder. The second gunman, seeing his employer down and his partner wounded, threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. Nathan climbed off Morgan's unconscious form. "Looks like your boss hit his head on the way down," he said to the surrendering gunman. "He'll live, but he's going to wake up in a jail cell." Sheriff Coleman and his men emerged from the bank, herding the remaining members of Morgan's gang. As they placed shackles on the unconscious colonel, the man who was once the terror of the valley, Liza watched, feeling an invisible weight lift from her shoulders. "What happens now?" she asked as they watched Coleman drag Morgan away. "Now he faces justice," Nathan replied. "A real trial with real evidence in front of a federal judge who hasn't been bought. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison. If he's lucky. And us?" Liza's voice was soft, uncertain. "What happens to us?" Nathan turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious but warm. "That depends on what you want, Liza. I know I hurt you by leaving." I know 5 years is a long time and people change. If you want me to ride away again, I will. But this time, it will be because you asked me to, not because I'm running from a fight." Liza stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. "I spent 5 years wondering what my life would have been like if you had stayed. I don't want to spend the next 5 wondering what it would be like if you left again." "Then I'm staying," Nathan said simply, "for as long as you'll have me. What about your work? Being a bounty hunter?" Nathan's smile was soft and genuine. For the first time since he'd returned to Willow Creek, "I think it's time I found a new line of work. Something more settled, more domestic, such as, well, I hear there's a ranch outside of town that might need a good foreman. Beautiful property, excellent water rights, and a very attractive owner." Liza laughed, the sound like music after the darkness of the past few days. "I think that can be arranged. But I should warn you, the owner can be quite demanding. She expects her employees to work hard, pull their weight, and ... And?" Nathan prompted, stepping even closer. ... And she has been known to fall in love with the help." "I'm tired of waiting for men to make decisions about my life," Liza said with a smile. But her eyes held a new kind of resolve. "I've learned to ask for what I want, and what I want is you. I want a real partnership, a marriage built on love and respect and shared dreams. I want to build something beautiful with you on this land that has been watered with so much pain." She took a deep breath. "Nathan Cross, will you marry me?" His surprised laugh filled the room. "Don't you think that's supposed to be my line?" Nathan's arms came around her waist, pulling her against him. "In that case," he whispered against her lips, "I think I'm going to like this job very, very much." He kissed her then, a kiss deep and passionate and full of promise. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes to everything." As their lips met in the dusty alley behind the Willow Creek bank, neither of them heard the cheers from the townspeople in the street, or the sound of chains as Colonel Morgan was dragged away. All that mattered was this moment, this second. Chance, this promise of a future built on truth instead of lies. The nightmare was finally over. The dream was just beginning. 3 months later, the Hart ranch was thriving in ways it hadn't seen since Thomas's death. The autumn roundup had brought in more cattle than Liza had dared hope for. The water rights dispute was settled in her favor by a federal court, and the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad had been forced to find an alternate route. Nathan had proven to be everything Liza could have asked for in a foreman. And more than that, he was the partner she had always dreamed of. Their relationship was a partnership of equals, passionate, deep, and built on a foundation of shared dreams. One crisp October morning, Dr. Williams approached the ranch. "Mrs. Hart," he said sheepishly, "I know I am likely the last person you want to see, but I brought something I think belongs to you." He held out a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "It was your husband's. I found it among Colonel Morgan's effects. And there is something else you need to know." Liza held her breath. "That morning, Thomas asked me to give you a message if anything should happen to him. He said that he knew you never loved him the way you loved Nathan Cross, but that being your husband had been an honor. He said, she deserves to be happy, and if Nathan ever comes back, I hope she will give love a second chance." Tears streamed down Liza's face as she clutched the journal to her chest. Even in death, Thomas had been thinking of her happiness, giving her permission to love again. That evening, Nathan found Liza by the fireplace, the journal in her lap. "Thomas knew," she said softly, her voice muffled. "He knew about Morgan's plans. He knew he was in danger, but he still wrote out because he thought he could stop it." "He was a brave man," Nathan said quietly. "No," Liza protested, looking at him. "He was different from you, maybe, but not better. You both loved me in your own ways. Thomas gave me kindness when I needed it most. But you..." You give me passion and partnership, and the kind of love I thought only existed in novels. Nathan framed her face with his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. I love you, Elizabeth Hart. I loved you 5 years ago when I left. I loved you every day I was gone, and I'll love you until the day I die. But I need to know, can you forgive me for leaving? Liza's answer came without hesitation. I forgave you the moment I understood why you left. And I trust you because you came back. Years later, when travelers passed through Willow Creek, they would often hear the story of the widow who nearly died for her land and the bounty hunter who rode back from the past to save her. They would point to the thriving Cross Ranch, where Nathan and Liza raised their children and proved that some partnerships are strong enough to weather any storm. The tale became a legend in the Colorado Territory, a reminder that justice might be delayed, but it would not be denied. That love might be tested, but it could not be destroyed. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys really do win. In the end. So, if this story stirred your heart, if you believe in love that's worth fighting for and justice that's worth pursuing, show us some love. Hit that subscribe button for more tales of Wild West romance. Smash that like button if Nathan and Liza's story moved you. And drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Are you team love conquers all or team justice? Delayed is not justice denied? Let us know in the comments. And if you know someone who believes in second chances and happy endings, share this story with them. Because out here in the West, the best stories are the ones where love wins.